Well, we've just read from Genesis chapter 19. Let's go back to the beginning of the time when we come across Lot, back in Genesis chapter 11. We read in Genesis 11 and verse 27. Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah begat Abram, Nahor and Haran begat Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren, she had no child. And so we see the genealogy of Terah, and it's the part above that red line is those we've been talking about, those that were born in Ur of the Chaldees. And we see Abram, and we see Lot on the far side, the son of Haran, who also had two daughters, Milcah and Iscah. Probably Haran was the oldest of the three, by the fact that Nahor then married his niece, Milcah, so it seems reasonable. And off they go a little later on their journey to the city of Haran. Lot, it seems reasonable that as he was orphaned at quite a young age, although he may have been as old as 40 at the time, but relative to their ages, I suppose that was quite young. He would have been then adopted by the childless Abram and Sarai. And so he went off with them when God called them. And of course, as he was the only son of Haran, presumably he would have inherited his father's wealth and his flocks, and he took those with him when they left Ur. And so we then see in the next chapter, chapter 4 and verse 12, we know the time, don't we? So Abram departed as the Lord had spoken unto him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed of Haran to go down towards Bethel and then on to Egypt. About the year BC 1921, if we take Bishop Ussher's dating. I'm not going to comment whether that's accurate or not. And if we take Jewish tradition, that would have made Lot about 41 years old. We see no evidence anywhere of how old Lot was at any time, but that's the Jewish tradition, that he was 41 at this time, and it seems a reasonable age for him on that journey as they travelled down, departing from Haran at that time. And so Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their substance, and they gathered the souls that they'd gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan. And so they journeyed down, first of all to Bethel, and then Abraham, of course, carried on down to Egypt. Lot continued to travel alongside him. We assume he went down with him into Egypt and back, because when Abraham had arrived back, we find that Lot is still with him when we come down into chapter 13. They'd been journeying together all this time, and they camped between Bethel and Ai. So they were camped around about that point there. And there was a quarrelling between their herdsmen. They both got lots of wealth, lots of riches as they come down. And there was this dispute. Chapter 13, Abram was very rich in cattle, in silver and in gold, and he went on his journey from the south even to Bethel, and the place where his tent had been at the beginning was between Bethel and Ai. And they made an altar there, and Lot also, which went with Abraham, had flocks and herds and tents, and the land was not able to bear them, that they might dwell, for their substance was great, so that they could not dwell together. And so we know the incident, don't we, of how there was that strife between the two very rich men with lots of inheritance and possessions, and they got more, no doubt, as they traded on their way. And so they find there's not enough pasture land there to support Abram's flocks and Lot's flocks. And, of course, the herdsmen would have been fighting over who was going to get the best grazing area so that they could produce those healthy flocks. And so Abram and Lot agree to separate. Verse 8 of chapter 13, Abram said unto Lot, Let there be no strife, I pray thee, between me and thee, and between my herdsmen and thy herdsmen, for we be brethren. Is not the whole land before thee? Separate thyself, I pray thee, from me. If thou wilt take the left hand, then I will go to the right. Or if thou depart to the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Abraham, although he was the elder, he had that right to choose. He gave up that right to choose which way to go, offering the first choice to Lot. And Lot lifted up his eyes and beheld all the plain of Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, even as the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt, as thou comest unto Zoar. Then Lot chose him all the plain of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east, and they separated themselves, the one from the other. And so we see that Lot looked towards the Jordan Valley, it says, that well-watered plain, the plain of Jordan, towards the area where Sodom and Gomorrah were. It was the time before God had destroyed those. Now, the traditional site of Sodom is down at the bottom of the Dead Sea there. It would have been very difficult for Lot to have seen it from where he was. And also it wasn't to the east, and it wasn't in the plain of Jordan. Yes, there were large salt deposits there, which we come across later. And there were bitumen and asphalt mines, as there are throughout the Dead Sea area. But as we said, it wasn't in the plain of Jordan, as verse 10 says. And it wasn't for him travelling east. But there is an alternative location. The area known as Tel Hammam, in the Kikar, literally the disc or the circle of Jordan, that area there. The southern end of the Jordan Valley widens out into an almost circular area. This area is called the plain, or in Hebrew the Kikar, the circle or disc of Jordan. It ends where the Jordan flows into the Dead Sea, and the cities of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim were located in the eastern part of that Kikar. And as this is the area that can be seen from Bethel Ai, that seems the logical place for these cities to be located. So, north of the Dead Sea, in the Jordan Valley, there are others who have suggested this area as well. Indeed, it's that area that we've said, the Kikar of Jordan, as we can literally translate it. There are no less than 25 geographical indicators that align this area of Tal El Hammam, the area that the archaeologists have discovered, with Sodom. And this Dr. Stephen Collins, amongst others, has done a number of archaeological digs in the area. Indeed, that 25 is more than any other archaeological site, so they claim. For example, there are 16 indicators to indicate the location of Jerusalem compared to what the Bible says. And of course it's an area which was east of Bethel, as Genesis talks about. Lot journeyed east. Scripture often tends to list the cities in order of prominence, and of course it lists Sodom first when it talks about these cities, doesn't it? It's always Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah and Zeboim. And indeed, this site, this Tel El-Hammam, is the largest site in the area by some margin, apparently. The archaeological discoveries seem to fit the time frame as well, about 1700 BC, the time of Abraham. And pottery and architecture and even destruction layers seem to fit with everything we're told within Genesis. And indeed, even as recently as the excavations which were carried out in 2018 of the royal palace in this city confirm it was a very important city in the time. Indeed, the palace walls were 1.5 metres thick. There was no common pottery found within the palace, apparently. And indeed, there's later research by other scientists which have shown that this city was obliterated by a high heat cosmic airburst. Just quoting about the annual meeting of the Near East Archaeological Society held in November 2015, when Dr. Stephen Collins and Phil Silver presented the paper on the evidence for their theory of the destruction of Sodom and the cities of the plain. The paper overviews the collective evidence for a cosmic airburst event that obliterated civilization, including the Middle Bronze Age city-state anchored by Tal el-Hammam in the Middle Gore, the Kikar of the Jordan of Genesis 10 to 19. Around about 1700 BC. Commensurate with these results are the archaeological data collected from across the entire occupational footprint, some 36 hectares area of Tal el-Hammam, demonstrating a directional pattern for the high heat explosive event that in an instant devastated approximately 500 square kilometres immediately north of the Dead Sea, not only wiping out 100% of the Kikar cities and towns, but also stripping agricultural soils from once fertile fields and covering the East Kikar, including Tal el-Hammam, with a superheated brine of Dead Sea anhydride salts, pushing over the landscape by the event's frontal shockwaves. In the aftermath of the event, soil science reveals a sequence of soil recovery on the Kikar of the Jordan that explains why it took at least 600 years for agricultural activity to resume in that area. So we see that this city that they've discovered was destroyed by some sudden explosion in the area. Just a suggestion, but it seems to fit for me. So if Lot was to travel east to Tel Hammam, then why does it describe then in verse 10, as thou comest unto Zoar? Well, Zoar was, it seems, about halfway down the Dead Sea coast. It's a city which existed up until at least the Middle Ages and was referred to there. But not necessarily, though, that Lot could see Zoar from where he was in Bethel. It does say, as thou comest unto Zoar. Perhaps as the Message translation puts it, which I think it's probably the first time I've ever said it's probably the most accurate translation, but it says, and stretching all the way to Zoar. I.e. the fertile area stretched down the Jordan Valley, going down as far as Zoar. Traditionally, again, it was south of the Dead Sea on the River Zered, 17 miles from the traditional site of Sodom, but some 58 kilometres from the site I'm suggesting at Tal el Hammam. Zoar existed, though, as a major harbour on the Dead Sea until at least the Middle Ages, and is recorded on the Madaba map, a mosaic map that's part of the floor of a mosaic Byzantine church of St George in Madaba in Jordan, not far from the location there. And this map is clearly a map of the Middle East at that time. Part of it contains the oldest surviving cartographic description of the area, and especially down of Jerusalem. It dates from the 6th century AD and clearly marks Zoar on the map on the coast of the Dead Sea. So it seems reasonable that was the Zoar that's being talked about. In Roman times, the Dead Sea level, although it's falling now, was even lower than today, and that Lisan Peninsula that you can see across there was probably cutting the Dead Sea completely in two. Roman roads have been discovered as the water level's fallen that shows that roads did go across there. And that would have made a harbour right down on the southern end completely useless. So more likely it was that river Arnon, on the Zoar on the river Arnon, halfway down the Dead Sea. Most of the commentators seem to suggest that this Madaba map just shows the deep north basin of the Dead Sea, and it was known as a port on a river. And indeed, Scripture seems to suggest that may well have been the location of it. If we just turn over briefly to Deuteronomy in chapter 34. Deuteronomy 34 and we'll start at the beginning. And Moses went up from the plains of Moab unto the mountain of Nebo to the top of Pisgah, that is over against Jericho. And the Lord showed him all the land of Gilead unto Dan, and all Naphtali, and all the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, and all the land of Judah unto the utmost sea, and the south, and the plains of the valley of Jericho, the city of palm trees, unto Zoar. And the Lord said unto him, This is the land I swear unto Abraham, and to Isaac, and to Jacob. So this was the land, and it went down as far as Zoar. And of course we know that the river Arnon, which is that river where it's located next to, there, was the border. That was the border between Reuben and the land of Moab. Exactly as it says here, the city of Zoar being that border. And so we continue down. And Abraham then, back in Genesis 13, he went the opposite way and he travelled down to Hebron, verse 18 of chapter 13. Abraham removed his tent and came and dwelt in the plain of Mamre, which is Hebron, and built there an altar unto the Lord. So travelling in a different direction. But it comes on the next chapter, we read of a battle, don't we? And it seems that Lot gets caught up in this battle. There's the battle between the kings of the east and the kings of the plain. There were 4 kings from the east. We're not sure exactly where they were. Particularly the tidal king of nations is very speculative, but it sounds like a Hittite king is the only reason you can put it further north than the others. But for whatever reason, they travelled from the east after the rebellion of the kings in the valley here. They rebelled after 14 years of submission, and they came to attack them. Chapter 14 and verse 4. 12 years they served Kedorlaomer, and in the 14th year Kedorlaomer and the kings that were with him smote the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, and the Zuzims in Ham, and the Ethims in Shaveh Kirithaim, and the Horites in their Mount Seir, unto El Paran, which is in the wilderness. And so they travelled down the east coast, taking all the peoples with them. And then they returned and came to En Mishpat, which is Kadesh, and smote all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites, which dwelt in Hazazon Tamar. So they've come back around and up. And the battle takes place in the valley of Siddim, somewhere in the Dead Sea area. Not clear exactly where the battle took place. The Dead Sea is famous for its bitumen pits, which is where they were falling into. Verse 10, the vale of Siddim was full of slime pits, as the AV says, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled and fell there, and they that remained fled to the mountains. Indeed, the Greek name for the Dead Sea is Lake Asphaltites, which is where we get the word asphalt from. It was famous for that bitumen and asphalt that came from the area. But as they fled, and the kings travelled further north again, they took Lot with them. And they travelled up north. It seems Lot was now dwelling in Sodom. Later he seems to have taken responsibilities in the city, sitting in the city gate, as we read in chapter 19. So possibly now he was a magistrate or something equivalent. And obviously then he would be a target for being taken as a hostage. But it's told, of course, of Abraham, and he sends with him. When Abraham heard, verse 14 of chapter 14, that his brother was taken captive, he armed his trained servants, born in his own house, 318, and pursued them unto Dan. So he takes his private army of 318 and travels up towards Dan, and finally catches up with them north of Damascus and captures them back and brings them back down, travelling some 190 miles. A significant size army, of course, for a man who was recently fearful of Pharaoh. He had trained men. The only occurrence of this word anywhere in Scripture, literally dedicated men. So were they specifically an army, or were they just security guards, perhaps, effectively? But for whatever reason, he managed to capture them and bring them back. We'll skip the next parts and move on to chapter 18. And we know the story of how the visitors come to Abraham and tell her that Sarah's going to have that child. But what we want to look at is the latter part of that. From verse 16 onwards, the men rose up from thence and looked towards Sodom, and Abraham went with them to bring them on their way. And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham that thing which I do?" And of course he was going to destroy the city. He was going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities of the plain, because their sin was so great. Verse 20, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous, I will go down now and see whether they have done altogether according to the cry of it, which is come unto me. And of course Abraham knew that Lot was in the city. And he was fearful for Lot, and he pleads for him. And he says, surely you're not going to destroy the righteous with the wicked. Peradventure, verse 24, there be 50 righteous within the city. Wilt thou also destroy and not spare the place for the 50 righteous that are therein? Why did Abraham choose 50? Presumably, he knew the size of Lot's family and his servants, and he expected, knowing what they were like when they left him, they were righteous as Abraham's servants were, that there would be at least 50 righteous within Sodom. And then he perhaps worries, well, perhaps a few of them, because of how wicked Sodom was, will have fallen away from serving the true God. What if there's only 45, or 40, or 30, or 20? What if some of those faithful people have fallen away in that wicked city? And it goes down to verse 32, doesn't it? And he said, oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak yet but this once. Peradventure 10 shall be found there. And the Lord said, I will not destroy it for 10's sake. Surely at least 10 of Lot's family would have remained faithful. We're not told how big Lot's family was. He, of course, had at least 2 daughters. And when we come into chapter 19 and verse 12, the angel said unto Lot, hast thou here any besides, son-in-law, and thy sons and thy daughters, and whatsoever thou hast in the city, bring them out of this place. It seems they were expecting a larger family. Well, are these the only family you've got here? Where's the rest of the family that came down with you? And so it seems that Abraham was quite confident that there would be at least 10 righteous within the city. And so we come into chapter 19 and we see Lot within the city. Yes, he had at least his 2 daughters. Did he have more family there with him? It's not clear. Verse 14, where Lot talks to his sons-in-law. It's not clear if these were married to other daughters he had, or whether they were espoused to the 2 daughters he had at home. It certainly doesn't seem that his daughters were too bothered about leaving them behind when they left. It was his wife that seemed to be worried about leaving the home behind. So perhaps they weren't quite as close as that. But whatever it is, it seems Lot's family by now was much smaller than Abraham remembered. And Lot's wealth, where had that gone? The wealth and the possessions that he seemed to have now were not reminiscent of the reason that he separated from Abraham. Perhaps some of them were taken in that battle of the kings that we've looked at in chapter 14. But perhaps some others were lost gradually as he became less wealthy as time went on. He took what he thought was the better location, let's not forget, but it proved not to be so. It seems Abraham's wealth was far greater by this stage. But Lot, it seems, had got a place in the society of Sodom. Chapter 19 and verse 1, and there came 2 angels to Sodom at even, and Lot sat in the gate of Sodom. A place of formal activities. A place where decisions were made, cases were heard, business transactions made, and even visitor registrations were processed. it seems Lot had become a prominent character within city life. Was he on the city council, effectively? Or was he, as they seem to accuse him in verse 9, this one fellow came into Sodom and he will needs be a judge? Will he now deal worse with thee than with them? Was he a city magistrate, judging the cases that came before him? Whatever it was, it seems that he'd become a man of character within the city. But he stood up for those principles that Abraham had taught him. He still remained faithful to the Lord God. And so these angels who came, they went to tarry in the city square. But Lot pressed them greatly and turned them in to his house. Did he know the identity of these visitors? Did he recognise them? Or was he always that hospitable to visitors who came along? No doubt he knew the dangers of being on the streets at night in Sodom. And he wanted to ensure that these visitors did not suffer that fate. And so he invited them back to his house, and he baked unleavened bread, and they did eat, baking it quickly so that they could sleep quickly, knowing the urgency of their mission. But the Sodomites, of course, had their own intentions, didn't they? Before they laid down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round about, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. People from all walks of life, all ages, all districts of the city were represented. Not everybody, of course. There were some that weren't quite as wicked as these people, but it was still tolerated. It seems this is the way that all strangers who ventured into the city were treated. But this mob was not allowed to have its way with these visitors. Those that weren't involved, though, were powerless to stand in the way of the way they wanted to continue. And they didn't like the stand that Lot was now taking against them. And so he offers them his daughters. A difficult situation, isn't it? Lots of people have struggled. Why did he offer those daughters to him? I don't think it was because he didn't care about his daughters. I don't think it was because, as some commentators suggested, it was those that were instigating, as all women lead all men astray, as this commentator suggested. The only thing I can perhaps suggest, but I'd be interested in other ideas, is that perhaps he knew the intentions of the men of Sodom, and he knew they wouldn't be interested in his daughters. A high-risk strategy, yes, but it did seem to pay off on this occasion. But they came to try and break down the door, didn't they? And the men, the angels, put forth their hand and pulled Lot into the house to them to shut the door. And they smote the men that were at the door of the house with blindness, both small and great, so they wearied themselves to find the door. They wore themselves out, groping for the door, as the ESV translates it. And of course, the door handle was not what they wanted to wear themselves out groping for on that night. And so the angels speak to Lot. Hast thou here any besides son-in-law and thy daughters? Bring them all to this place. Call all the family together and explain God's purpose. And he explained it to his sons-in-law. And Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and said, Up, get you out of this place, for the Lord will destroy this city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. They thought he was only joking. They understood Lot's faith, and they respected what he believed. But they didn't seem to share it. Not when it came down to it. Not really. Perhaps outwardly they would accept, but now it wanted a commitment. They were not committed to the Lord. Yes, they understood that Lot's ways were better, but they didn't see the dangers of the world around them. And the dangers there, again, are for us, aren't they? We can see the world around us and not see how dangerous it really is because we're so used to it. We see it every day. And so they have to go. And when the morning arose, when the angels hastened, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, Arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him, and they brought him forth, and set him without the city. Take the daughters. Leave. Go now. Even Lot hesitated. Did he want more time to convince his family? He was not convinced of the impending judgments, perhaps. Again, it's the lesson which Jesus brought out when he reminded us just of this situation in Luke 17. And he said, Likewise also, as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be when the Son of Man is revealed. In that day, he which shall be on the housetop and his stuff in the house, let him not come down to take it away. And he is in the field, let him likewise not return back. Remember Lot's wife. So Jesus warned them, and he warns us not to linger, to remember the dangers, and to run when necessary. And so off he goes, and he goes, first of all, he's offered to go to the cave, but he says, Please, can I go to Zoar instead? Was he too old to make a journey to a cave? Not that convinced. About 26 miles from Sodom to Zoar, using that location on the map. I'm not sure why he preferred Zoar to the cave. Perhaps it was just the comforts that he thought perhaps his family would prefer. But then, verse 15, as morning dawned, they arrived there. They arrived in Zoar as the sun was risen, or literally as the sun has completed its course. So they'd taken that whole day to reach down to Zoar before God destroyed the cities by raining down sulphur. Perhaps from a violent earthquake spewing up that asphalt, such as is still found in the region. We could look at Isaiah 34 and verses 8 to 10, which talk about a similar situation in the area. But Lot's wife, she looked back. She looked expectantly, looking back with regard, literally looking not necessarily from behind him, but afterwards. She wasn't just glancing over her shoulder. She turned back towards the city when she saw it being destroyed, towards her friends and her family that she'd left behind and she didn't want to lose. What she'd left behind was more important than what was ahead. And we've seen how she became a pillar of salt. That's not, although it's called Lot's wife, I suspect it's not genuine. And Abraham, early in the morning, verse 27, looked down and saw what the Lord had done. He saw the smoke from Hebron. He could see that smoke rising early the next morning when he looked out. Even there, from such a distance away, he could see the smoke rising from Sodom. And Lot, when he'd seen what had happened to his wife, was afraid to live in the cave, was afraid originally to live in the cave, and now he was afraid to live in Zoar. Was he afraid that Zoar would also be destroyed? He saw the sinfulness in that city and didn't want to stop there any longer, wanting perhaps at last to protect his daughters from the world. And if he was fleeing from Zoar, he would flee presumably away from Sodom. There is a traditional site of the cave which is known as Lot's Cave, a further 26 miles south of Zoar. It seems a reasonable location, but not any particular reason why it would be. Indeed, nowadays it's a tourist attraction where you can go and visit, part of the lowest place on the earth museum. But for whatever reason, he went to live in a cave. And his daughters saw that their father was now getting old, perhaps about 65 at this time. And there was not a man to carry on that family line, and they readily agreed to a plan to do so. They had to get their father drunk because they knew he wouldn't agree to it. But they still saw it as a normal way of action because they had to preserve that family line. Because there was that danger, wasn't there? That danger for Lot when he became out of control of his actions and he went through with their plan, that sinful plan of his daughters. There's no record then of what happened to Lot and his daughters and his grandchildren thereafter. We see that Moab and Ben-Ami were born. Did they all continue to live in the cave? Of course, Moab and Ben-Ami would have been exactly the same age as Isaac. Did they ever meet? But we do know that God did look after these children, and they became great nations in their own right, living alongside Israel. For most parts, it wasn't good relationships with Israel, but God preserved them and protected them as Lot's inheritance. Deuteronomy chapter 2, just quickly. When they were travelling into the land, and verse 8, "And when we passed by from our brethren, the children of Esau, we dwelt in Seir, through the way of the plain from Elath, and from Ezion-Geber we turned and passed by the way of the wilderness of Moab. And the Lord said unto me, Distress not the Moabites, neither contend with them in battle, for I will not give thee of their land for a possession, because are given are unto the children of Lot for a possession." And again in verse 19, and when thou comest nigh over against the children of Ammon, distress them not, nor meddle with them, for I will not give thee of the land of the children of Ammon any possession, because I've given it unto the children of Lot for a possession. And so they were still a part of God's family because they were relatives of Abraham, and God looked after them. There's lots of lessons there for us, aren't there? Beware of the dangers of the world, the influence of that world. Lot went into Sodom because he thought it would be an easy life. And he could withstand the influence of the world around him. But he lost so much, didn't he? He lost his wealth. He lost his family. He didn't think of the effects on his family. And I suppose that's the lesson particularly for us, isn't it, from the life of Lot. We need to think, yes, we may be able to withstand a particular temptation, but let's make sure that we don't put temptations in the way of those we love and care for.